Okay, let's begin with module number 5, where we will study Jesus calming the storm. We're studying the synoptic gospels. And just to review, Matthew was the outcast from the Jews who loved his enemies and those who mistreated him. Mark was a coward. He was a coward on the very first mission trip, but he became fearless and in the end was of great service to the Apostle Paul while he was in prison. Luke was the historian, not a Jew, a doctor by profession, and he fielded a number of eyewitnesses to the gospel events, and we're not sure who they are. A lot of people originally thought that Luke must have relied on Matthew and Mark exclusively, but there's so much in Luke that is unique to him, and therefore we know that he relied on other eyewitnesses. He didn't just make it up. It's history. It's solid. It's a narrative of the gospel events from someone who heard them from actual eyewitnesses. So Luke, a responsible historian. We're now looking at our second incident in the life of Christ out of 7. And so we focus on the method of harmonizing the Gospels. Now, when we talk about harmonizing the Gospels, I want to be very careful about something. Each Gospel was inspired by God the Holy Spirit to be a unique message unto itself. So it's not like I'm saying the inspiration is only the harmony. It really isn't. In fact, it's the other way. The inspiration is only the unique gospel, the Gospel of Matthew. And so, but we know that we have absolute, responsible historical narrative that every detail in each of the Gospels is true. And this is thrilling because then we can say, well, if we have something perfect, they don't criticize each other, they support each other. And so this is where we're at. And they amplify each other. And it's like when you hear a song and in just a melody, and then you hear the same song in 3-part harmony, it's incredible, right? It's just all the more beautiful and all the more impactful. So I want you to get this method down, and so we're going to do it 7 times. This is number 2. We'll focus on the power of the threefold eyewitnesses, and we'll remember often the love of God for the world. And I hope that you get this point, and to the point, it's my prayer for every student who takes this class, every person who listens to this lecture, that Christ will dwell in your hearts. That's the ultimate goal. So we're acquiring skills to defend the inerrancy of Scripture from those who accuse the 3 synoptic Gospels of being filled with contradictions. We're acquiring the skill of harmonizing 2 or more incidents in the synoptic Gospels. We should be able to do this, right? They should assemble together pretty well. And the more we do it, the more skillful we are. And then be able to communicate the insights gained from a harmony. Now listen, we're not inventing anything. I call on you to be strict in sticking to the narrative and not filling in any kind of speculation. I hope that I'm not doing that, but there are insights you get when you see this from 3 different viewpoints. So translate the passages or use a good literal translation. Step 1. Step 2. Choose which gospel has the fullest account. Sometimes it's a judgment call, but go with it. Go with what you think is the best. In the other Gospels, select the information not included in the first and mark it. Underline it, highlight it, circle it in some way so that you know that each part has its unique information. Determine the sequence of all unique events, and then smooth out the transitions between the three into a harmony. And finally, develop a logical outline of that harmony. In this lesson, we're going to look at the calming of the storm. They depart from across the sea, and then Jesus calms the storm. Matthew 13:53 and 8:18, and also 8:23 to 27. And because Matthew is thematically arranged, it's not a knock on its historicity, it's not a knock on its accuracy, but many preachers will take from the Bible everything that relates to alcohol, everything that relates to anger, and they'll put it together into a thematic sermon. That's what Matthew did. He arranged his gospel according to various types of incidents. And so it's not in strict chronological order. It's not a knock on him. That's the way he did it to be effective with his audience. Then we have Mark 4:35 to 41, and Luke 8:22 to 25. This takes place summer into fall, 31 AD, in Galilee, up north, near the Sea of Galilee. So let's read from Matthew 13:53. It came about when Jesus finished these parables, he left there. And then we'll pick it up again in Matthew 8:18. So it's right after Jesus finishes the parables. And then 8:18, Jesus, after seeing the crowd around him, gave orders to depart for the other side. So there, again, the Sea of Galilee is 6 miles across, or about 9 kilometers, or maybe more, a little bit more than that. And so you can hop in your boat and go across. I think actually 8 miles and 11 kilometers or 12 kilometers across. And so it's not far. If you have a halfway decent wind, you can be over to the other side in as little as a couple of hours. And so, and then we pick up what happened before. That's just setting the stage. And then in 23 to 27 of Matthew chapter 8, after embarking with him into the boat, the disciples followed him. We're going to talk about how that all makes sense in a moment. And then behold, a great shaking, a seismos occurred on the sea, so as to swamp the boat by the waves, but he himself was sleeping. And after coming to him, they woke him, saying, Lord, save, we are perishing. And he says to them, why are you cowardly, little face? Then after rising, he rebuked the winds and the sea, and there came about a great calm. Now the men marveled, saying, what sort of man is he that the winds and the sea obey him? Let's go to the Gospel of Mark now. He says to them on that day, after evening had come, let us pass through the sea unto the other side. And after leaving the crowd, they, that is the fishermen, took him along, since he was already in the boat, and the other boats were with it. And there came about a great gale of wind, and the waves were cast over into the boat, so as to almost fill the boat. And he himself was in the stern upon the pillow sleeping. And they woke him, and they said to him, Teacher, is it not a concern for you that we are perishing? And after being aroused, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush, be silenced. And the wind abated, and there came a great calm. And he said to them, why are you cowards? Do none of you have faith? And they were afraid with great fear, and were saying to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? And then finally, Luke's gospel. It came about in one of those days that he and his disciples entered a boat and said to them, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." And they were launched out. Now, as they were sailing, he fell asleep. You see, I've got an ominous musical theme there. That's something from the Greek language that tells us that not music, but just something bad's going to happen. And a gale force wind came down into the lake, and were continuously swamped and continually in danger. And after coming to him, they roused him, saying, stand up, we're perishing." And after waking up, he rebuked the wind and the wave of the water. And they stopped, and it became calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" And after being afraid, they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this man that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him?" So choose which gospel has the fullest account, and I've chosen Mark. Mark seems to be the fullest continuous account. In the other gospels, select the information not included in the first and mark it. So in Matthew, we've got this supplementary information from 13. As he finished the parables, he left there and then ate 18. And this is great because we kind of get an introduction to our event. And Jesus sees the crowds around him, and he gave orders to depart for the other side. So there was something about all those crowds that wasn't appealing to him, and he thought, well, let's vacate here, and we can go to the other side, and it's 8 miles across, or stadia, or whatever he said to them. And we can be there in an hour or two, maybe a little longer, but they have to walk all the way around. So they're walking 15 miles, 20 miles, where we're just sailing 6 or 8 miles. So we can beat them. So then Matthew 8 also has, behold, a great shaking occurred on the sea. He actually says seismos, an earthquake. Which is hard to do on a body of water, but we'll get to that. Tells you something about Matthew. And so the boat is being swamped by the waves, and he says to them, "Why are you cowardly little faiths?" And as we'll see, there's some chronology to this as well. And then I've also marked up Luke 8, 23 and 24. As they were sailing, he fell asleep. And a gale force wind came down into the lake, and they were continually being swamped and continually in danger. And after coming to him, they roused him, saying, stand up, we are perishing." And after waking up, he rebuked the wind and the wave of the water, and they stopped, and it became calm. And he said to them, "Where is your faith?" Now, it's great we chose this one, or I chose this one, I think for this reason. It's more challenging to develop the chronology out of this one, and so that's cool. And it'll be good to see that. There's quite a bit more unique information from all 3 Gospels, and so it's exciting in that way as well. We get to see a number of details, and yet similar too. And when we put it all together, we're going to have this really nice harmony, I think, a full narrative, let's call it. Notice in Matthew says, because we have to determine the sequence of all unique events. Notice in Matthew, Jesus says, "Why are you cowardly little faiths?" before he calms the seas. But in the other Gospels, he says something similar, but after he calms the seas. And so, what we have here, we have to include both. He had to have said both, and that's really nice. He's really, what you get when you harmonize the 3, and you pull it together, you get this impression he's really working on them to develop their faith. He loves them. He knows that they have to develop their faith in order to be the future of the church in this world. So then we smooth out the transitions between the three into a harmony. I couldn't fit the harmony all on one page because it's a pretty big section, and Mark is already not going to fit on one page. And then we have a lot of unique stuff from Matthew and from Luke. So just listen along and see how I do with this. Get the feel for what I'm doing, and see if it helps you see the incident in some new ways, and it helps to see it from multiple viewpoints, and see if it puts you in the scene. That's what having multiple eyewitnesses does. It really puts you in a scene. It came about after Jesus finished these parables, and seeing the crowds around him, he gave orders to depart for the other side. He left there after evening had come. After leaving the crowd, they took him along, since he was in the boat, and the other boats were with it. And after embarking with him into the boat, the disciples followed him. And he said to them, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So there's a lot in this scene, right? So they leave the crowd, and the fishermen take him along. He's already in their fishing boat. And the other boats were in a little group of fishing boats. And the disciples said, "Well, he's in the fishing boat. Let's go get in with him." And then he says to them, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake," which was probably pretty obvious at that point. So here's part 2. As they were sailing, he fell asleep. And behold, there came about a great gale of wind, and a great shaking occurred on the sea. And they were continually being swamped by the waves, continually in danger. And he himself was in the stern, upon the pillow, sleeping. And after coming to him, they roused him, saying, stand up, we are perishing. And teacher, save. Is it not a concern for you that we're perishing?" Notice how I put those into two different statements from them. Perhaps it was one disciple who said, stand up. And another disciple said, teacher, save. Aren't you concerned we're perishing? And he says to them, why are you cowardly, little faith? It's not complimentary. I mean, all this while, the boat's shaking, gale force winds, they're being continually swamped. It's obvious they're in danger of their lives. And he says, why are you cowardly, little faith? And he uses this expression, little faith. I think we'll talk more about that in a minute. And after being aroused, so he fully wakes up, he rebuked the wind and the wave of the water and said to the sea, hush, be silenced. And the wind abated, and there came a great calm. And he said to them, why are you cowards? Where is your faith? And they were afraid with great fear. And after being afraid, they marveled, saying to one another, who then is this man that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him? So we develop a logical outline of the harmony. And I've got this in 3 parts. The circumstances, part A, regarding their departure for the far side of the Sea of Galilee. The pressure of the crowds, the convenience of the boat. In part B, we have the event of the storm, the advent and danger of the storm, Christ's disposition during the storm, the disciples' reaction to the storm, and the rousing of Christ, and Christ's response to their reaction. Part 3 of our outline is the calm. Departure, storm, calm. And Christ rebukes the disciples. And he rebukes the storm. And the disciples have their fears and their doubts. So, this storm, have you ever been through a very chaotic moment, an accident, a storm, a crisis of some sort, where things happen very quickly? There's always this great confused jumble of thoughts and ideas. Here, coming from Matthew and Mark, two different sources, and Luke, who interviewed other eyewitnesses. Well, let's talk about Luke's possible eyewitnesses. We've got Matthew and Peter. Then there's 10 other disciples. And then there's the fishermen in their boats. Luke had a lot of possibilities. There's a little further confusion because Matthew has rearranged his material and departed from the chronological arrangement of the other Gospels. And so his Gospel records the events in 3 different places in 2 different chapters. And it's only because of Mark and Luke that we can put this back into a chronological order and away from the chaos of Matthew's arrangement efforts. Now imagine interviewing the surviving disciples. I said Luke had 10 other disciples. I should have said 9. Judas wasn't around for Luke. And so imagine every one of those guys had a different viewpoint, a different opinion. What I really like is that Matthew evidently doesn't have a lot of experience with the sea. I appreciate that about him. He's the one who calls it the earthquake. And so it's a big chaotic jumble. And there's yelling and screaming. And to be honest, very abrupt words from Jesus, not sinful, but confrontational for sure. And you go from all of that, and your life is in danger, to the very next moment, dead calm. In the midst of a crisis, even people who are only a few feet from the others may differ in the order of events and even the substance of the points of the crisis. The 3 Gospels have some of those confusing elements, but we have a miracle of inspiration. And they do harmonize into a cohesive account. So we can be thankful for this harmony. Gives us the big picture. An advantage that the single Gospels don't have. And then, remember, it's a 2 eyewitness system in the Mosaic Law. And that system exists for 2 reasons. One, the frailty of the human perceptive abilities. We have our 5 senses. They can be frail. We a lot of times, did I really see that? We question what we saw. We have to go back over it again. And then the sinfulness of the human condition as well. So the 2 eyewitness system prevents the telling of lies, the perjury sin. And so, the circumstances regarding the departure for the far side of the Sea of Galilee. There's the pressure of the crowds. Christ finished his parables from Matthew 13:15, or 53, excuse me. As you may recall, he gave these parables from a fishing boat just off the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The crowds were arrayed on the beach before him. He finished his parables and had to make a decision on what to do next. Then Christ surveyed the crowds before him and determined it would be best to leave for the other side. So now Jesus, after seeing the crowds around him, gave orders to depart to the other side. Matthew gives the exact words. Mark gives the exact words. Matthew said he gave orders to depart for the other side without a direct quote. It's indirect. But Mark has quotations. Let us pass through unto the other side. Let's pass through the sea to the other side. And after leaving the crowd, there's a little mystery in Mark. They took him along since he was already in the boat, and the other boats were with it. So the verb paralambano means to take someone along with you on a journey of some sort. If you assume that the disciples have said this, it appears they are leaving at their initiative and not Christ. But the subject of the verb is not made clear by Mark. He left it out because he thought it would be obvious to the readers, and it should be. The owners of the boats are the obvious subjects of the verb. The owners of the boats perceived that Christ was already in the boat, and they were already going to the other side of the sea, so they decided to take him along. Yeah, we'll take you along. But on the other hand, the disciples aren't in the boat yet, so Jesus calls out to them. Remember, it was him alone in the boat to give the parables. That was his preaching platform. And so he exhorts them to get in the boat with him. Let us pass through to the other side. And so we come to the event of the storm. And as they were sailing, Christ fell asleep. I have a terrible time sleeping on an airplane. And even if it's a smooth flight, I can't get comfortable. Even if it's an overnight flight, I can't get comfortable. And so Jesus was a good sleeper. He went in the boat, storm suddenly comes up. Remember, it's night. And weathering a terrible storm at night in a sailing vessel can be a terrifying experience. We've had some experience on the seas around the island of Tahiti. And from time to time when we go swimming in the lagoon, the seas are rough. And it really can be an adventure. And then, of course, when we ride the ferry over to our neighbor island, it can be really rough. And so minor compared to what they were going through. But I imagine a couple of months ago, we were swimming out on the ocean and a storm came in, a tropical squall. We were 150 meters from the shore. And yet the rain came down so hard that we could not see around us. And it was weird. We weren't scared, but it was weird. It was a strange experience, and I could see where it'd be easy to be scared. Matthew describes the surprising nature of the storm with a single word, idu, look. When you see something surprising or awesome or amazing, look. Luke identifies the source of the wind as coming down onto the lake. The verb katabaino means descend, so the wind swept down from the hills around the lake. Mark and Luke agree with reference to vocabulary. It's a lilops anemu. And in Mark, Lilops megale anemu. Lilops is a gale. So Luke says a gale force wind. And Mark says a great gale of wind. Not a hurricane, not a tornado. They can't occur in the region, but it was a serious wind. And very scary. It can cause great waves. So Matthew says a great shaking occurred. But, as we go through the gospel accounts, we see that Peter and Luke were used to boats, and they both knew how to describe this phenomenon with the correct vocabulary. But here Matthew identifies himself as kind of a landlubber, a guy who doesn't get on boats very often, because he employs the word seismos to describe his own experience, and it means earthquake in the Greek. And Matthew experiences an earthquake at sea, and he didn't know what to call it, so he called it an earthquake, kind of like saying it's a sea quake. And it seems certain he's ridden out an earthquake before, but the storm at sea is the closest thing to that experience, so that's what he calls it. I wonder, Matthew probably just didn't like boats. Maybe after this, he really didn't like boats. But you can see he just uses the best analogy. What I love about this is that it adds to the authenticity of the account. Matthew says a great shaking occurs, and he doesn't know what to call it. Well, it's really cool how authentic it is that we have the guy not used to boats trying to describe the wind, and it doesn't detract from the authenticity. It adds to it. All three gospel writers agreed that the boat was on the verge of being swamped by the waves of the sea. The waves were coming over the rail of the boat and causing it to founder. Luke 8:23 adds, those in the boat were continually in danger. Ek endunuon is the imperfect tense, portraying a past action in a continual state. They were in a continual state of physical danger from the storm. The danger was real. But Christ's disposition during the storm, Christ had fallen asleep. And what's amazing is during the storm, he remained asleep. Mark records in 4:38 that Christ was in the stern. Another little detail, right? And you get these details and you think, that guy was really there. He knew exactly where in the boat Jesus was. Now, my experience is that being in the stern can be really bouncy in the ferries and the boats that we have. In a small craft, it's bouncy no matter where you are. In bigger craft, you want to be amidships, I think, and then and then up in the bow, it can really bounce, and in the stern, the same thing, getting the full force. From archaeology, we know that a typical boat on the Sea of Galilee was about 27 feet in length. Not a large boat, a little smaller than an average modern sailboat, but enough to have a small cabin. So there's Christ in the boat. It's rocking and swaying. I've experienced this thing where the boat corkscrews through the water, and that's when it really gives you the mal de mer, the seasickness. And so it really goes. And so it's rocking and swaying violently, but his head is on a pillow or a cushion, still just fast asleep. Been a long day of ministry. I know that feeling. The disciples' reaction to the storm. So they saw the situation as helpless. They went back to the cabin in the stern of the boat. And Matthew says, Lord, save, we're perishing. While Mark says, Teacher, is it not a concern for you that we are perishing? And Luke has, and let me just comment on this. It's so funny. It seems so dignified. And when I think about the ultimate source as Peter, easily the most excitable of all the disciples, it makes me smile a little bit. It's not that Peter is lying. It might not have come from him. He just remembered someone saying that, and that could well be it. So first you have Matthew, Lord, save, we're perishing. And from Peter's viewpoint, teacher, isn't it a concern for you? We're perishing. And then Luke, stand up, we're perishing. And I think all three are equally true. And the scene plays like this. The disciples go in and rouse Christ. And as he wakes, at least three of them blurt out these things around the same time. It wasn't like one said, the other said, the third said. I think there's three that are remembered. There could have been 5 or 8 or 10 of them. You can only imagine the confusion that was a part of this scene. But 3 of them express, stand up, we're perishing. Isn't it a concern for you, teacher? And then the other says, Lord. So all 3, I think, have to be included. But doesn't it add to the authenticity of the scene? Doesn't it feel real, like you're standing with the 12 disciples in the rear of the boat in that little shelter, and they're blurting out things to try to rouse him? And Christ wakes up, and the first words out of his mouth, why are you cowardly, little face? Deloi is the first of the 2 descriptive terms that Christ inveighs against the disciples. Cowardly. They're afraid they might die, and this has affected their thinking. They forgot who was in the boat. Or maybe they didn't. The second term is a ligopistoi, and it's a derisive term that's literally translated little faith. I remember with the Bible I grew up with, in the King James, it says, O ye of little faith. Well, no, it's not like that. It's more confrontational, more abrupt. And you should perceive this as a kind of taunt. Christ is prodding his disciples with this word. He's describing them perfectly. His intonation is truthful. And he's trying to get across, look, your problem is you lack the information, ready information in your minds. In a crisis, you have to be ready. You have to practice. You have to be ready. And what he's saying is you're not ready. You don't know how to relate this to who I am. And so he calls them little faiths. Little faiths. He does this on several occasions in the gospel. So you can imagine that this is in the middle of a great crisis, and the boat is about to sink, and the storm is roaring, and the boat is shaking, and the disciples are shouting, at least 3 of them all together at Christ, and Christ just stops. He takes a moment, and he rebukes his disciples for their lack of faith. But make no mistake, this is a rebuke. And then Christ has words for the storm. He rises then and rebukes the storm. The verb is epitimao, and it means to speak words harshly, to go beyond an honorable mode of thinking, to rebuke. The actual words that Christ spoke are contained only in Mark's gospel. Remember when Christ said, let's go, and we have the actual quote, and then we have Christ commanded them, and that's the indirect quote. Here it's the actual words, siopa, pefimoso. And they're really quite close in meaning, but the first, siopa, is almost always spoken to a person. And it's designed to get them to stop talking. The present imperative here commands the person to stop talking and to stay silent continuously. And so it's interesting. Christ treats the storm as a person. And he tells the storm to stop talking. The second comes from phimoo, pephimoso. Also, it's a command to a third party to silence a different person who's talking out of place. Perfect imperative, very powerful. You don't get perfect imperatives all that often, I believe. And so it essentially comes to mean stop forever. But it's a command, would you tell that person to be quiet? So the first is Christ talking to the storm like the storm is a person. And the second is Christ commanding a third person to silence the storm. Is it possible that there is an entity, a personage, who is causing this storm? Oh, I think there is little doubt. And Christ addresses directly, it says he told the storm to be silent, and then let the storm be silenced to someone else. Who would that be? I think he's talking to the Heavenly Father here. So he addresses the storm directly, or the demonic personage behind the storm. And then he calls upon the Heavenly Father to silence him. Pretty cool what you get from the original languages, right? As a result, a great calm came over the waters. Mark describes the happening with the verb genomai, which tells us that the calm appeared out of nowhere. We know the reason. What a tremendous contrast. First the storm, and then the calm. No wonder it's described as a great calm. So there they were on a suddenly glassy sea without a whisper of wind. The disciples would have been standing in front of Christ, bedraggled, probably soaking wet, and really appearing quite silly, I think, in sight of the circumstances. One moment they're yelling and screaming, the next moment he rebukes them and rebukes the storm and calls upon the Father to do it for him. Wow. Incredible, right? And then they're just a bunch of wet disciples standing there looking foolish. But before the disciples could say holy mackerel or some other appropriate statement of utter surprise, Christ speaks. He says, "Why are you cowards? Do none of you have faith?" And I think it's an appropriate, perfect reiteration of the statement only moments before. So right before he calms the storm, he calls them cowards and little faith. And then he calms the storm, and then he says it again in the silence. Are you aware of that expression, a deafening silence? Or so quiet you could hear a pin drop? It was certainly calculated by Jesus, because in that silence, maybe he lowered his voice and just said it in a calm fashion. Why are you cowards? It just says, in normal tone of voice. Do none of you have faith? Calculated. How truly effective it must have been. What impact those words must have had. So the rebuke strikes at the faith of the disciples. Remember that faith is based on truth. You need information on which to place your faith before you can exercise it. Had the disciples understood the principle of the storm, they would have been able to relax and sleep under the stern shelter with Christ. And this faith is supposed to replace fear. The juxtaposition of fear and faith shows that faith casts out fear. The disciples failed to understand this prayer of Christ when he says, Siopa, right? Pefimoso. Well, Matthew has him marveling at this whole thing. It means to consider something with a mental attitude of awe. Something's occurred here that gave the disciples an appreciation of awesome power at work. But Mark puts it a different way with his gospel. He says, Epo betheson phobon megon. They were afraid with great fear. This utterly terrified them. And I think I get it. Number one, Jesus is abrupt with them and confrontational. And number two, he calms the storm. And number three, if he's mad at us and he can calm the storm, imagine with just a few more words what he might do to us too, so they're terrified. But of course, perfect love casts out all fear. Who is this then that even the wind and the sea obey him? As if they no longer know Christ. As if this incident has confused them about him completely. But something does not settle well with this conclusion. The disciples had already eyewitnessed many miracles from Christ. He had healed and done miracles. He'd even cast out demons, demonstrating his authority through the Spirit over them. They should have known better. And even with fearing him with a great fear, they didn't understand his love. Again, they're just little faiths. He loved them. He saved them from the danger of the storm. So let's look at how this harmony gave us the full picture. Just a brief review. Mark 4:35 gives the exact words of Jesus, let us pass through unto the other side. All three gospel writers agreed that the boat was on the verge of being swamped by the waves of the sea. They were coming over the rail or the side of the boat, causing it to founder. Mark records that Christ was in the stern. And there are three versions to what the disciples actually said. Lord, save, we're perishing. Teacher, is it not a concern for you that we're perishing? Whoever did that, they're putting Jesus on a guilt trip. Mark records a biblical incidents of the passive-aggressive mood. How do you like that? There's nothing new under the sun. And then stand up, we're perishing. The actual words that Christ spoke are contained only in Mark's gospel. Siopa, pefimoso. They're really quite close in meaning, but no. One calls upon a third person to do the silencing. And so you put all this together, and boy, we've just got an amazing, exciting moment in the life of Christ. And I pray that you realize that Jesus is on your side. Right now, today, he's your advocate. He's sitting at the right hand of the Father, directing intervention for you. He is, as you love him, he's making all things work together for your good. And so he loves you. He works for you. And he is mighty indeed. Respect his power, love his character, and be the benefactor. And above all, grow in faith, grow in the knowledge of grace and Jesus Christ himself. Amen.